Today, Sylvie and I are in the East Hertfordshire village of Standon, which is situated on the modern trunk road, the A120, and nowadays is conjoined to another village named Puckeridge. We're going to be starting our walk from the southern end of the village, which is where we're now walking to. This magnificent old building is an old schoolhouse, and it's thought to date from medieval times. We stopped directly opposite this school to look at an old relic which is stood right under this tree. This massive lump of rock is known as Hertfordshire pudding stone, which is a naturally formed type of concrete and is found naturally in this part of Hertfordshire. Right next to this rock is Paper Mill Lane, which is where we're starting off on our walk. A few hundred yards down the lane, we go through a gate and onto a footpath. As we walk across this large meadow, it's difficult to imagine that we are actually walking on what was once an old railway line. And this railway line is what used to be the old Buntingford Railway. We made this video in May, and so the whole countryside is ablaze with Mayflower. When we reach the end of the meadow, the footpath diverts off the course of the old railway and down to a gate. But we want to stay on the railway route for much of the first part of our walk at least. So we turn left after the gate and we walk up this path. But this eventually brings us onto a junction on the path, and after a quick check of the Ordnance Survey map, we know we're back on track. The Buntingford Railway opened in 1863, serving mostly rural communities in a largely agricultural area. But like many small branch lines, during the 1940s and 50s, they simply weren't being used enough to keep them economically viable. And the Buntingford line, like so many others across the country, fell victim to the beaching cuts in the early 1960s. And the line was eventually shut down in 1965. As we walk down this dark trackway, it's hard to imagine that steam engines once thundered through here. The track eventually emerges into open fields before we follow a path along the edge of this piece of woodland. The old railway originally cut diagonally across this field and then went down along where this trackway is now. As we walk along the trackway, we come across one of the few remaining relics of the old railway, and it's this old concrete railway workers' shed. Nowadays, the shed looks completely out of place in a rural landscape. The only other giveaway signs of the old railway are these old concrete fence posts, which were typically used along railways in the early 20th century. When we reach the end of the wood, we say goodbye to the old railway line and turn off towards our next destination, the village of Much Hadham. This path will take us for about 1.5 miles before we actually reach the village. Eventually we reach a place called New Barnes, and the trackway becomes a tarmac lane known as New Barnes Lane. This lane goes for about half a mile before we emerge onto the high street of the village of Much Hadham. As we walk into the village, we pass the old Red Lion Hotel, which began life a few hundred years ago as a coaching inn. The High Street is lined with many quaint, old and historic buildings, making it one of Hertfordshire's prettiest and most desirable villages. An old palace exists in the village, and this used to be the home of the bishops of London from medieval times up until the 1800s, when it was turned into a lunatic asylum. Nowadays, however, it's been converted into private housing. But there's one building that we can't wait to get to, and that's the Bull Inn public house, which is the last remaining pub in the village.
When you do go to sleep, you're not playing on some gaming device or watching YouTube.
Cheers.
Sound like you needed that.
Oh, that's lovely.
Well, after a much needed drink, we continue our walk through the village. Sylvie and I stopped to admire a lovely cottage garden, and right next door is what used to be the local blacksmith's workshop, which is now a museum. We continue walking along the high street, passing many lovely ancient old houses. Eventually we come to the old Crown Public House, which shut down as a pub years ago and is now a private house. But it's here that we leave the high street and take this little lane down to some meadows. We follow a path across the meadows, and this brings us out onto a narrow lane that leads up through this steep wooded hillside. When we reach the top of the hill, we find ourselves in the village of Perry Green. We walk through the village until we reach the village green, and here is the Henry Moore Foundation. We follow the footpath which actually goes through the main gate and past the main entrance of the foundation. Well, we haven't got time to visit the foundation, but some of Henry Moore's sculptures are visible along the path that runs around it. This enormous sculpture is right by the footpath, and you can actually go inside and walk round it. Henry Moore moved to Perry Green in the 1940s after his home in London was badly damaged during the Blitz. We continue along the path until we reach a gate, and after that we turn left and walk along the edge of this field full of sheep. As we continue along the path, we come across this huge sculpture of a reclining nude, which is perched on a large mound overlooking the surrounding countryside. As we continue along the path, we come across this enormous sculpture which stands at the end of a field right next to a pond. Well, we're now heading back to Perry Green, where I want to show Sylvie where Henry Moore is buried. The footpath here brings us out to a point where we first entered the village, and it's here we find St Thomas's Church. A quick walk across the churchyard and we come to where Henry Moore and his wife are both laid to rest. We're now setting off on our long walk back to Standon, and we head off across the field back towards Much Hadham. This path takes us through the woods on the hillside and eventually brings us back out onto the lane into Much Hadham. Rather than walk all the way back through the high street, Sylvie and I take this other route along Oodle Lane, which runs parallel to the high street but lower down in the village. Oodle Lane eventually brings us out onto the high street directly opposite the Bull Inn. Sadly, it's getting late and we don't have time for another drink. We're going to follow the high street right out of the village and take a different route back to Standon. The original plan was to follow a small lane just outside of the village, which would have been a quicker route back, but major roadworks on the A120 has forced a lot of traffic to divert onto other routes, and what would have been a very quiet little lane has become a rat run for tons of traffic, and there isn't any room for pedestrians. So Sylvie and I, we walked for about half a mile along the lane to where my map says there's a footpath that will take us to our next destination. We followed the footpath for about a mile across country until we come to a very confusing junction on the path. Paths head off in all directions from here, so we try and follow one that we hope will be the quickest. Unfortunately, the path we chose was so overgrown we couldn't get through. So we've had to backtrack across the field and take an alternative path up the hill. This path takes us through woodland and eventually brings us onto a narrow lane in a place known as Wellpond Green. As we walk along the lane, we're pretty surprised at how many multi-million-pound mansions there are tucked away behind the trees here. It seems Wellpond Green should be renamed Well Minted Green, in my view at least. We finally leave Wellpond Green and head down the hill towards Standon. The lane into Standon eventually brings us to the point where we started off, and we were shocked to find that our 8-hour walk has taken us over 15 miles. But it's been an interesting walk, and we hope to see you next time when Sylvie and I are off to visit the city of Cambridge.